Okay. So again, Dr. Stevenson, I'd like to thank you for joining us today once again and participating in the Black Faculty Recruitment and Retention Oral History Project for the Racial Justice Group Initiative. I'd like to thank you for taking time, and I'd like us to just sort of begin where we left off in our conversation last time. I believe Kasamba, Omar also have some questions that they'd like to bring up. Okay. But if my notes are correct, I believe we left off with UF and your experience at UF, and you kind of talked to us about why you decided to join UF. Okay. And sort of the next question, we have here is, have you experienced racism at UF at your time at UF? And if so, would you share with us what happened?
First thing, one of the reasons I came here is because when I applied for the position, they were talking about moving the AfricanAmerican Studies program to a department. And I've always wanted to work in the AfricanAmerican Studies department, because I think that one of the ways that we're going to engage and increase the scholarship about Africans and Africans in diaspora is by having men and women who have PhDs and master's degrees in that area. One of the problems with just getting a scholarship out is there are very few schools in the country that offer a PhD in African American Studies. So that was one of the reasons I came here. In regards to racism, I think that personally, I have not had that problem, but I think that systemically, it is still overshadows the way that we do things. For instance, I came from a university that was primarily, can you hold 1 second? I got a call from my office. Hey, Yesenia. Yes. Okay. I apologize. That was my office. We're still trying to get my new hire. So I'm permanent now, and so they're changing my business cards and all that kind of stuff, and they sent me this long welcome stuff, whatever. Anyway, I think that I came from a university that was primarily a teaching university, and so writing articles, book scholarship was not as high of a priority. However, I bring 30 years of experience in the classroom to the class. And so when I applied for the tenure track position, the reason I didn't get it was because of my scholarship. Now, I wonder if a white person would have gotten the same kind of reaction if they were applying for a position as a tenure track position. They had 30 years of experience and yet didn't have a number of books written. So I don't know if that would qualify, but I do know that there are areas at the university where people don't have as much experience as I have, and maybe and even scholarship as I have, and yet they are at least allowed to participate in tenure track. So that would be my only experience where I think that the protocols were more racist than anything else, because a Black person with 2 masters, 2 doctorates, 30 years of experience, and you can't, consider them for a tenure track because they don't have enough books published. I don't know if that is really a reason to prevent someone from moving a track. However, I did get hired as a lecturer, and there's a track for that. So that would be my only experience that I could say would have been, and I would call that racist. I don't know if that was intentional or systemic.
I actually have a question. So we talked about last time requirements for tenure. Can you describe what it is here at UF, that process?
As much as I know, they take into account, one, your scholarship. The University of Florida is a Research One university, which is significant in and of itself, right? I mean, we're number 6 in public schools in the country. We dedicate anywhere between $700 million and $785 million a year for scholarship for research. So that's important, right? We are air, land, and water grant university. So when you start bringing in someone in for tenure, what you want to do is you want to bring someone in who has, one, who has a certain level of scholarship because you want students to be attracted by that scholar. Once you start getting into the master's degree area and the PhD, you want to work with someone who has expertise in your field. So I'm assuming that because I came out of theology, right? I have theological degrees as well. That's where I spent most of my education. And this is a secular institution that doesn't focus on biblical studies, theology, church history, stuff like that. That could have been an argument. But normally when you're on a tenure track, one, they want you to publish. Two, they want you to be that attraction for other students who might come and want to study under you. And that's how you build your department. And also when you have a number of tenure track positions, they're trying to fill 5 of them now. You want to bring in scholars who are different areas. Like I'm the only one in there who does 17th, 18th, 19th century African-American and African studies, right? My area primarily is the Middle Passage and diaspora, whereas Canton is 21st century. You follow me? So, but he's written 2 books. You get the point? So that was because where he came from, that was a requirement. Where I came from, that was not as much a requirement. But if you look at my teaching on a 5.0 scale, my average is 4.9. I've exceeded the university's means, the college means, and my departments all 3 years I've been there. So because that's what I focus on, because that's where I came from. You get the point? So I think that one of the ways that the university could kind of rectify the way they keep professors who are not only teachers but also researchers is maybe look at the fact that where you came from may have been part of the reasons why your scholarship is not at that higher level. Because if you look at some of the people who are writing books, their teaching means are below. I got one guy, he's a friend of mine, been there 20 years. He said, I've never gotten past 3.8 in the college mean because he's more of a researcher. So how do you balance that out, right? And especially if you're looking for people of color who tend to come from universities that are more teaching universities than research universities.
So kind of a follow-up to that question. Are there more obstacles for like Black faculty and faculty of color because they're mentoring more students here, focusing on like advising student groups and things like that? Like,
say it again? Are there what?
Oh, are there more obstacles for Black faculty and faculty of color because they're like mentoring student groups, mentoring students, and like they have like UF isn't diverse and there's only a few like Black faculty and faculty of color, so students tend to go to them for help. Do you think that they have more obstacles compared to their white peers because of that? I mean, like in terms of like doing more research and publishing.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that, for instance, that's a great question because our new director, Dr. Canton, is helping me get my publishing. Like I'm writing a book now. I'm working on a manuscript, trying to get it published through the University of South Carolina Press. And some of the insight that Canton has given me, I'd never gotten before. Right now, he's African American. He's been through the process, and one of the things that I've oftentimes talked to my students about when it comes to the difference between the HBCU and the PWI is Black professors tend to see their students as a legacy or an inheritance or part of the family, right? Whereas white professors, not all, but many of them see Black students as a threat. So they don't give us the kind of insight that we need to travel through these various hoops and obstacles that are in place, right? But also, European professors tend to know the loops, whereas and the loopholes, right? Whereas I'm just learning some of those loopholes, primarily because I didn't need them before. But I think that, like, I just sent an email to Dr. Canton. I received 3 campus diplomat awards, and I don't know if you're familiar with what they are. But they were from students who say, "Hey, man, you really showed us what it means to integrate our lifestyle and your commitment to us as people to education." Researchers tend not to do that, right? because they're just about the data. But if you understand Black people, especially people from African descent, relationship is far more important than the stuff. That's why even if we show up to a meeting late and we start introducing ourselves in the late meeting, it's because the relationship is more important than the meeting. The meeting's going to go on, right? And so it's those kinds of dynamics that we bring to the table that oftentimes does not filter into the European environment when it comes to mentoring and student development, et cetera. Because I'm more concerned about my students passing life than I'm about them passing my class. I mean, you can pass the class just by memorizing material. But when you graduate and you have to make decisions for my grandkids and my great-grandkids, that's what I'm more concerned about. Am I creating the kind of character with this information in my classroom that will create a person that will make good decisions for the future? I think those are two different approaches.
My next question, and so I don't take up too much space, this will be probably my last question for a minute. Can you talk about coming to UF because they're trying to make a department of African American Studies? How is that going here? And do you have any more like insights on what we can do more or how UF can support it?
Yeah. Well, one, yes, I think we're moving. Dr. Canton has done an amazing job. I think, as far as I know, they've hired 5 new professors who are tenure qualified. But I think that, again, when it comes to Black professors, PWIs tend not to want to pay the money, right? They'll pay the European professors, but they won't pay the Black professors. So it's still kind of like a plantation, right? We want your skills, but we don't want to pay you. I think the second thing is, and this is really important, this happened to me in Grand Rapids, and that is when people talk about diversity, they're often, when some white people talk about diversity, what they have in mind is a person of color who behaves like white people, not a Black person or Hispanic person or an immigrant who brings their culture to the table. Because what happens in these PWIs is they are undereducated when it comes to what we call cultural competency, right? Because the assumption is that diversity and inclusion and cultural competency can be conflated, and they're two different things, right? Diversity, inclusion, and racism is primarily about oppression. Diversity and inclusion is about acknowledgement. Cultural competency is about affirmation. It is affirming that person that, one, my culture and your culture may be different. However, we work better together when we work better together. Right. And so I have to acknowledge, by affirming your gifts and talents, that brings you closer to being the person that is respected, that is honored, and feels like they belong. That's an entirely different thing than diversity, because you can have diversity by just having people of different genders, right? But if they don't have any power, then you've just wasted your time, right? Because diversity and inclusion require redistribution of power. Cultural competency says, I affirm you regardless of the power issue. Racism says, because of your skin color, I'm going to oppress you because that's the way the system works. Those are 3 different things, and yet we conflate them, and that's why we have such a problem at a place like PWI, because these kind of conversations are very difficult to have. And I'm telling you 3 reasons why they're difficult. 1, because when we approach them, we begin from debate. We want to argue our point. Or we have a discussion, but we don't take into account the importance of the personal experience. What we want to get to is dialogue. Where dialogue is where 2 opposing people come to the table with a desire to find a resolve, regardless of who's right. Those are 3 different approaches to solving the same problem. And until we get past debate, we'll never get to dialogue.
Just to kind of follow up on, I'm sorry, Deon, go ahead.
No, go ahead, George.
I was just going to sort of follow up on Omar's question and ask if, from your view, what do you think the university could do differently to recruit and retain Black faculty members?
Well, I think part of it's salary. I think the other part is just I think that we need to have safe spaces like this. I told my wife the other day, I said, I was looking forward to getting back to this conversation. Not that I needed it personally, but there'll be people coming behind me who need to be able to say, hey, you know what, that's my experience, right? So we need to have a safe space where we can talk about things that are legitimate, but also where we don't feel like we're going to be punished if we say what's on our minds. I think for the average Black person, especially in academia, we're very clear that there's some places we just ought not say what's on our minds because it has the potential to mess up our careers, right? We don't have the same opportunities that a white person has when it comes to finding employment in academia. We just don't. First of all, because there's not that many of us. Less than 1% of the American population have PhDs. And you look within that 1%, you know, it's a very small population of Black people and brown people with PhDs. So trying to get into these positions is very difficult. So when you get one, you kind of, hey, man, I'm going to hang on the best I can. And so in order to do that, sometimes you have to acquiesce. I think that UF, if they're really serious about retention, we have to create an environment where these conversations and these discussions are not happening because there's a grant, they happen because it's normal. It has to be a opportunity. When we hang out with the brothers and the sisters, that conversation is normal. But why do you think we have slang? Why do you think we code switch, right? Because because we're very clear in certain environments, this is not a good conversation, right? I think personally, and I think it's one of the reasons why I've been so successful in my classes, is from day one, I try to create the environment where everyone knows what you have to say is valid, even if we disagree with it, right? It is important that you know that what you think, what you feel, what you're experiencing is important to the rest of the growth of the group, right? And my students appreciate that. And I think that's one of the things we have to do. We have to create these multiple spaces where these kind of conversations can take place without people being feared they're going to be punished if they do.
Indeed, that's a great point you bring up there, Dr. Stevenson, about the safe space. Could you talk about that safe space drawing from your experiences with HBCUs? I believe you said you attended Lincoln, and I believe you taught at Grand Valley State as well. Talk about, and you talked about the difference from like that first year you went to Penn State and then going to Lincoln.
Okay.
Right? Talk about that difference of experience and what HBCUs can or what PWIs can learn from HBCUs.
Sure. Okay. The first thing that PWIs can learn from HBCUs is Black people are loud. And it doesn't mean that we're mad. We just make a lot of noise. That's who we are. When we're on campus, and I belong to Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So if I see a brother at an HBCU across campus, I'm a holler, yo, frat, what it is, But you can't do that at PWI. They call the cops on you, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, again, in the PWIs, oftentimes Black and brown students are seen as a problem. They're going to ask too many questions. They're going to ask questions I can't answer. They're going to ask questions that are controversial. Whereas in HBCUs, our professors challenge us to be critical because they realize for most of our lives, we've not asked questions. One of the biggest problems with Black people in America, we are afraid to ask questions of authority because the assumption is, especially coming back from the plantation, you don't ask me questions, you just do what I say. So whether we know it or not, it has become normal to not be inquisitive, right? You cannot do scholarship and not be inquisitive. It always begins with a question. We know that the world is round because somebody said, if I keep going to the east, will I fall off the edge? Questions. You go to a doctor's office, the first thing they're going to do is ask you questions. So, inquisitive and being inquisitive is important. And HBCUs, because the professors have experienced that life without asking questions, when they get to a point where they can change the narrative, they do. right? And so we have to create a space where inquisition doesn't mean you're dumb. How many of us Black students have been in a classroom and we wanted to ask a question and the professor was condescending because the question allegedly, well, you should know this. Well, if I would know it, I don't need to be a student. The whole reason I'm in school is because I don't know it. You follow me? And so, I've seen students and I've asked students, when I ask them questions, they sit there like bumps in the log because they're not accustomed to being allowed to ask a question or respond in a manner that may not fit. One of my rules of engagement in all my classes is there are no dumb questions. The second rule of engagement is everybody has a right to say what's on their mind as long as they're not belligerent, as long as it's not profane, and as long as it's not deprivation of someone else. Why? Because we never learn how to communicate cross-cultural, cross-race, unless we are in an environment where it's safe to do it. And education has got to be transformative. It can't be just about information. So when I'm teaching my classes, I'm trying to transform not only the way my students see the world, but recognizing they're trying to transform the way the world sees them. And that's what happens in the HBCU. And the HBCU lets us know that Black skin ain't going nowhere. It's a liability, right? Because we live in a racist environment. However, when I start opening my mouth and I can talk about the books I've read and stuff I've done, that changes the narrative. But we've got to find a place where people learn how to do that. And HBCUs do it very well.
Indeed. I mean, we've got to definitely maintain that curiosity about each other, man, in affirming and seeing the value in each other.
Right.
Indeed. Tell me something. In your in the previous interview, you said something that had me curious about integration, and you were saying that integration.
I almost got kicked out of school for that, but go ahead.
And if it's too controversial, we could leave it alone. But when you think of when I think and I look back at your experience coming out of high school and integrating into the system, tell me why you say integration is what it is for Black folks. Why in writing that paper and what it meant.
Okay, so economically speaking, Black people spend more money in white communities and Asian communities than they spend in their own communities. So the dollar does not circulate. So therefore, we have a higher level of crime because we have more people unemployed because we can employ them in our companies because we don't make the kind of money to pay the overhead. When we owned our own companies in our own cities like Black Wall Street, we weren't concerned about white folks bringing money into the community. We had our own banks, so we controlled who got the loans. We had our own health system, so we controlled the doctors. We had our own cab system. We had our own transportation. We had our own libraries. And so we hired our own, we supported our own, we raised our own, and we weren't concerned. But when you start going into white communities, the first thing, this, if you're a Black person, you walk into a store, the first thing you're concerned about is if the security guard's looking at you to see if you're going to be a criminal, right? But what happens to the dollar in the Black community when it's not being recirculated? One, ma and pa stores either go out of business or their prices are so high you can't afford them. So what do? You drive to the mall or you drive to another community where you're spending your money. Well, when you're spending your money somewhere else, you are depleting your own environment. In the Jewish community, the dollar normally circulates anywhere between 20 and 25 times. In the Dutch community, between 15 and 20 times. In the Black community, it doesn't circulate. The moment we get paid, we go to the mall. Right? And so when we start integrating, you're always giving up something unless the other group of people are integrating into your community. White folks don't come into the Black neighborhood to buy stuff except for liquor or drugs. They don't come to buy our clothes, they go to the mall. Black people, we can't wait to get to the mall, and then we spend this exorbitant price on something that we can't use. We got $5,000 rims and we're living with mama in them. right? And so, but when you live in a community and you work in a community that's supporting itself, then the field is level, right? You see your aspirations in your neighborhood. So you can see the doctor and the trash man. You can see the school bus driver and the teacher. You follow me? But when you start integrating, right, oftentimes we integrate into a community that doesn't want you there anyway. And they're not going to help you grow. At least if you're in a community that's like you have people who can mentor you, right? I talk to my young brothers about going to college. I talk to them about finance. I talk to them about credit scores, right? I always tease my wife when I first met her. Before I wanted her phone number, I wanted to know what her credit score was, because if she's in debt, I ain't got time. Now I use it as a joke, but the point is, in an integrated environment, those conversations tend not to take place. But when you have people who are the same ilk, I have a brother who's in osteopathic medicine. He does total knee and hip replacements. You know how he learned about that stuff? Me. He went to Lincoln University. What frat did he pledge? He pledged my frat. My oldest son is a kinesiologist. How he learned? It was me. He pledged my frat, went to Lincoln University. I have a sister who has a doctorate of theology. Where she go to school? Lincoln University. Well, how she learned it? She got it from her brother. You see? So, I mean, it's those kinds of things that help us to become successful that don't happen when you start integrating into a culture that doesn't want you there anyway. We have to integrate at least to understand the rules. But once we get the rules down, personally, I believe we ought to be nationalists. I think that we ought to put our money back in our community, because when I can get a loan for a house from a person that owns the bank in my community, I'm going to be respected. That money is going to turn over. Someone else is going to get employed, et cetera. But when I take my money out to another community, I'm giving it to them. They don't want me anyway. They're going to increase the rates, the insurance, the interest rates, and I still might not get what I want.
That's a great point you bring up. Dr. C, when you look at the role of the community within, for Black faculty, staff, and students, you may just look here at the UF. You hear how much the first Black faculty talk about the community being part of their experience, made them feel welcomed when campus was not as welcoming, when they were still integrating campus.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to today's time. Because of integration, we have sort of lost that community, that safe space that we once had. We could have gone across the train track. How do we today cultivate that sense of community amongst faculty, staff, and students? How do we cultivate that sense of camaraderie in light of integration, in light of us living different places?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the town and gown concept. You talked about town and gown. So one of the things that I've done is, one, I belong to an organization called the 100 Black Men, right? Where they are 25 years old. They've worked on mentoring young Black kids. Two, going into the middle schools and talking to the teachers. I was invited by the Alachua County Public School System to go into Oakview School twice and talk. They have an African-American Studies curriculum they're using now. And I talked with some of the teachers on how best to, or not how best, some best practices on talking about the diaspora, talking about slavery, talking about the Middle Passage. So we have to go into the community. Three, I think we have to connect with the churches. In the Black community, still one of the most powerful organizations is the Black church. We got to connect with the pastors, right? We have to ask those pastors, hey man, what do you think about having, I'm getting ready to do a 4-part series called Nubians in the Bible. It's going to be live on Facebook, right? And I'm going to talk about how racism has taken the scriptures and extracted Black people from the Bible. When in fact, if you ever study scripture, the first 400 years of the Israelites were in Egypt. Now, I don't know if you noticed it now, but Egypt is still in Africa. It ain't moved. It was never a third world country, and it didn't just move, right? So what are we saying? Do you think that these Hebrews were Europeans? Of course not. You look at the crucifixion, right? The Bible says, and again, this is biblical studies class. The Bible says that a man named Simon from Cyrene carried the cross for Jesus. Well, where's Cyrene? Libya. Where's Libya? North Africa. So, I mean, it's those kinds of things that we have to be able to do in our community. So we got to get to the churches, we got to get to the kids, and we got to get to the school. That's our job. We can open those doors by making ourselves available, right? But we have to also understand that when we go in there, we have to teach at a level that helps them understand, but gives them a desire to want to do it again. I just came back from West Michigan. I did a cultural competency conference for the city of Wyoming, the police department, the fire department, and the upper level staff. I just got off a Zoom call this morning at 9 o'clock. They were so elated, they want me to come back in July and do another whole week of training for their city. Why? Because the city's changing, but the Dutch people who run the city don't know how to communicate with the Black folk, right? So we got to get out there. Now, this is hard work. One of the things I tell people that this is hard work. And it's hard work because we spend so much of our time debating it and arguing that we never get to a place of understanding. But somebody's got to do it. So that's what I would recommend.
If I might ask some questions. How you doing, Professor Stevenson?
I'm well, man. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Sweet. So I wanted to know if you could speak about the importance of Black mentors, especially when you are in a PWI or just when you're in a predominantly white space. And if you could also maybe touch on any of your students that you might have mentored that you may remember.
Sure. So one, you can't be what you can't see. And if we look at the media, except when it comes to athletics, the only time we really see positive conversations about men, Black men, is in sports, right? Same thing happens with women. One of the things I asked my the people I was doing a conference for, I said, how many of you use the GPS system? They all raised their hand. I said, do you know who invented the GPS system? They said no. Do you know? A Black woman by the name of Gladys West, who is a Ph.D. in mathematics. Now, here's the point. Why don't we know that? Because any relationship that has the potential to be successful has to have a foundation of history. If you go to a club, you see this little tenderoni, right? You want to get some history. You want a phone number with a mama name, where you've been at, what your name is. You want to get history, right? And part of the problem with America is because Black and brown people have been deleted from the historical narrative, the assumption is that white people have done everything. So mentoring helps us to build historical relationships with people. There are a couple of brothers back at Grand Valley State University that have gone on, but I tell you one that speaks to me most significantly. When I was in seminary in California, I had a student that was taking a church history class, and I shared with them that I used to smoke weed. Now, I know y'all guys never smoke weed, never get high, but it's okay, I get that. But I used to smoke weed. And and I shared that in a class, and this guy was in the class. Eventually, we became good friends, and so I would meet with him like once a week, once every 2 weeks, and we would talk about research methods and so on. When he graduated from Harvard with his Ph.D., he sent me this letter. He said, Dr. Stevenson, he said, one of the things that made me want to be a scholar is because you were so transparent. And I think that one of the most important things that Black men can do with Black youth is be transparent. Because the assumption is, and I do this in my classrooms too, the assumption is as professors, we arrived like this. We got here like this. And we don't talk about the struggles, you know. All throughout my academic career, I only flunked one class. I got an F in Hebrew. And if you know anything about Hebrew, it reads backwards. You can't figure out the letter. It is horrible. It is one of the most, how God talks Hebrew is beyond me. That's why I always talk to him in English, because I can't. Anyway, the point is that when I shared those two instances, it was what happened to the students. They saw a person, right? They didn't see this scholar on a pedestal, right? And so I think that for young Black youth, they, one, need to see us. Two, they need to hear us. But three, they need to recognize that even though there are obstacles, those obstacles are just opportunities to get better. And we can show them how to navigate those obstacles, because white men don't have to navigate the same obstacles as Black men, right? You know, I'll give you one more example of the difference in navigation. So, and Deon has seen me around. I wear bow ties all the time. I wear custom-made suits. I have my shoes made in Italy. When I walk into a classroom, I probably got $2,500 worth of clothes on, right? Custom-made watches, whole 9 yards. So I'm on this elevator, right, in Grand Rapids. I get on the elevator, and this white woman clutched her bag, right? Now I got locks, got my lock, but I'm in a suit and tie. I'm down, right? My watch probably cost more than everything she had on. But the point is, Black skin's a liability. So we have to help Black people understand that your skin doesn't make you inferior, but in a white world, there are some obstacles. And so we can't walk around with our pants hanging around our butts, you know? We can't, you follow me? Where white boys can do that and get away with it, Black guys, they see criminal, you know? So it's those small little tweaks that we have to be able to do so that we can at least get in the door. Now, once we get in the door, then you go crazy, right? But when you first show up, you got to make sure you look like someone that they're willing to hire. Now, that's the problem, but it's just the way it is. You got to play by the rules. If I said I'm going to play football and I come out there with basketball uniform on, they think I'm in the wrong place because I got the wrong uniform on. The same thing happens with life. You got to wear the uniform that's going to get you in the door, whatever that is. And we as African-American men, especially if we travel these roads, we can show them what that uniform looks like. Does that make sense?
I see.
And for the record, there ain't nobody dressing fresher than Dr. Stevenson. I've known him for almost 3 years, and I remember the first time I see him, and I'm like, yo, this guy right here, man, you know? So, you know, Dr. Stevenson, if I may jump in on that point, you know, you talk about the importance of mentorship, you know, in seeing us and being us, in affirming and valuing us. Can you also talk about allyship? And I bring it up because, you know, in your first talk, you talked about when you went to grad school, and you talked about the importance of Ruth Tucker.
Yeah. And
how she influenced your or your decision to go into that field. Can you talk about allyship in for faculty and staff, students, the importance of that allyship and how to best work it?
Sure. So you have allyship and then you have partnership, right? Allyship is a person who actually really gets the heart, the meat of the problem, and they're ride or die, right? They got it. They may not be your culture, they may not even be your gender, but they feel your pain. That's an ally. They are attached at the hip. Partners, they can throw some money at you, they can open a couple of doors, but they're not as invested. When you become an ally, you are saying to that other person, whatever you're going through, I'm going through with you, even though I don't have to. And I think that's the key to an ally. An ally is someone that says, my problems are not your problems, but my problems are your problems because they are a problem for you. You see the difference? Whereas a partner says, I recognize a problem. I'm not going to get hurt in the process, but I'll slip you some money. I'll write you a grant. I'll open you a door. An ally says, I'm going to stand on the front line with you. And even though I could avoid it, I choose not to, because when you're in pain, I'm in pain.
Can you give an example of an allyship in your career?
Yeah. There's a guy named Scott Stabler. He's a Ph.D. at Grand Valley State. He does the same time zone I do, but he works primarily on the Confederacy and stuff like that. And so there was a position opening up in the history department. I was in African-American Studies, but I wanted to teach a couple courses in the history department. And no one would vouch for me. And Scott went to the chair and said, listen, man, this guy right here can help us bring more students into our department. Now, I realize he's been here 10 years, he's an adjunct professor, but if you bring him over here to teach these one or two courses, I promise you it'll work out. And they did. And I eventually blew it up. I taught a couple American history courses with the African-American influence, and it blew up. And I really believe that if Scott hadn't gone to the chair, it wouldn't have happened, you know, and he's a white guy. And here's the other part. Scott used to be a staunch racist. He grew up in the South, and he he called one of his, he was a baseball umpire. And he called this guy a boy. And the black guy took him aside and said, if you weren't my friend, I would kick your ass right now, but I'm going to teach you a lesson. And I'm on tape, ain't I? You might have to erase that part. What's that thing they do when they say the names have been changed to protect the innocent? You may want to do that part. But anyway, that was his trek, right? Now, Scott and I are best, but when I went back to Michigan, I lived in Michigan for 19 years. When I went to Michigan, I only saw 3 people, my tailor, Scott, and the guy I went to work with. Everybody else, I didn't even care. And Scott and I went out. He came to one of the sessions and was a community, participated in a community conversation because that's, when I talked about the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, I called on him and he gave an elaboration to the community that I could have never done. So, you know, he didn't have to be there. He didn't benefit from it. He was there because he knew I was trying to do a work in that community. And as a black guy in a predominantly white community, to hear a white voice support what I said was important. That's an ally.
Indeed. Thank you.
So George, you're Greek.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I saw Altos in your gender designations.
Yes.
Yeah,
I am born and raised.
Okay.
Partially. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Greek's a better language than Hebrew.
Yes, it's not like you said.
Yeah.
Right to left. It's left to right.
And the letters are more like, you know, Latin letters, so you can kind of almost figure it out when you see it. But that Hebrew thing, man, with the diacriticals and all them little dots, oh my God.
You know,
Right about,
Dr. Stevenson, if I may ask about your faith, man, you talk about your studies in theology and your faith being a part of who you are, man. Could you talk about your faith and how that informs your research, your life?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a Christian. Grew up in a Christian home. My father was a deacon for 60 years. My grandfather was a deacon my great-grandfather was a deacon for 75 years. So I grew up around the church. I didn't I didn't grow up in the church. When I was 13, I left because it didn't make sense to me, because I couldn't understand why Black people would worship a white Jesus. It just didn't make sense to me. This guy with blonde hair and blue eyes didn't make sense. But as I got older, I began to realize there was a void in my life. I didn't know exactly what it was, and it was spirituality. And then as I began to start seeking where I belong in the universe, it became very important for me that I balanced myself both in my secular way of seeing the world as well as my spiritual way of seeing the world. So I got saved and started walking with the Lord. I went to seminary and I pastored for 30 years. And I thought it was important that Black pastors be trained. One of the things that turned me off from the church was there was a lot of hooping, a lot of hollering, but it didn't make a lot of sense. And I never wanted to be that guy. I felt that if you really want to change a person's life, you have to affect their mind as well as their hearts. People, you don't have to be credulous to be a believer in anything, whatever your faith is. You ought to have some kind of intellectual foundations to it as well. Second thing is, when I started studying African people, Africans are very religious, but their religion is more connected to how they understand the universe. Unlike European approaches to religion, it can be tangential. That's how come you could have a Methodist pastor, a Methodist preacher be a slave owner, because they weren't in the same category. They would compartmentalize. Africans don't think like that. They realize they're a part of this bigger process. And so they're always trying to work to stay in unity with it, because we are very relational. And one of the things that began to attract me as I got older with Christianity is the relationship. You can be a Buddhist and never meet Buddha. You can be Muslim and never meet Muhammad. You can't be a Christian and not meet Jesus. It's a personal relationship. And so that was important to me. And as I began to understand that and then to walk in it, I realized that my faith had to inform my scholarship. My scholarship didn't inform my faith. Because if my faith didn't inform my scholarship, when I first started reading about the plantation and the way they raped our women and the way they beat our women, I hate all white people, right? But I had to understand that we're dealing with people who have, quote, sin natures, unquote, and that we need to have people who are revolutionary in the way that they exercise their faith, right? And so when I taught a course that semester called Race, Religion, and Rebellion, and I introduced all these various concepts, because I think that one of the things that happens with oppressed people, they can become liberators of the oppressor, as well as the oppressor can be liberators of the oppressed. You didn't get that. That was really deep right there. In other words, when you are an oppressor, you are just as much in bondage as someone else. It may function differently. When you're afraid to walk that, you're still in bondage, right? But there is a freedom that comes when you walk in your spiritual existence, when you recognize that there is nothing on the planet that belongs to you that you will not get if you're walking in your spiritual existence, whatever it is. And we have Baha'is, we have Buddhists, we have, Santiera. I mean, we have all different types of spiritual approaches. But when you start walking in that, there is a level of freedom that allows you to be who you are, and you are no longer required to fit into that European box, whatever that box is. And my faith has challenged me to remain Rik Stevenson, regardless. Right? You say, I'm the freshest dress you see. That's part of who I am. That's not going to change. I don't care how hot it gets. Y'all can wear slippers and I ain't doing it, because that ain't who I am. It doesn't make up who I am spiritually. You follow me? That is a part of Rik Stevenson. And so it is those kinds of dynamics where our faith says you are unique. You don't have to be like anybody else. And who else could you be better than yourself anyway? I'm the best Rik Stevenson you're going to find. Now, I'd be a horrible Deon Winchester, but I'm a Rik Stevenson. You're not going to find a better one than me. And that is because of who I believe God has created me to be.
You talked about And let me back up and say we are thankful for you, Dr. Stevenson, for who you are and all that you have and all that you represent. You know, you talked about the church and the church not only being a place of community for us people, you know, but how does you said the church still plays a role in forming and helping shape that community for us today? You know, there would be some who may disagree with you and some who may say that, you know, the churches or the role of the Black church within the Black community has changed and has, you know, especially in its relation to the younger generation, you know, with faith and the church being so important to our movement, to our existence. Speak to that point today. Is there a schism existing, or is it going in the other direction? Or are we getting closer? What is it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think Zoom has really amplified how stoic the church actually can be, because primarily when the average person talks about the church, they're talking about a building. But the church is actually made up of people. The church is the people. But we have been accustomed to going to a place. And what Zoom did, it reminded us that the church is not that building because we couldn't get there. But did we stop having church? No, we just added another technological entity to make sure we could still do it. And the churches that were successful were able to create a Zoom platform to make it happen. In regards to the schism, I think you're absolutely right. I think, first of all, the older guard of the church was very insulated, right? Siloed, cornered, right? Whereas this new generation, they think outside the box, right? The kind of issues that my parents had are not the same kind of issues I've had. I'm a baby boomer, right? And the kind of issues that my sons have are different than my issues. And yet they still need to find a safe place. And we have to be able to understand that concept and approach it differently, right? We used to have Boy Scouts in church. We used to have those organizations don't exist as well in church they used to. So we have to do other things, right? One of the ways, and I'll give you a perfect example. So I ride a motorcycle. I have a custom built Softail. And when I first started riding, I was riding with a lot of guys who didn't go to church. And I don't know if you've ever seen me with my shirt off, but I have 13 tattoos, and all of my tattoos are scripture. On one side, my left side of my body, all my tattoos are in Hebrew. All the other ones are in Greek. And oftentimes they're conversation people. Why bikers have tattoos. So when I started riding bike, matter of fact, I don't know if you can see this. Pull this up. Can you see that? A little bit, okay. It says Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And it's got the ichthys, it's got the little fish on it, right?
Yes.
On this side, I don't know if you can see it, it's in Hebrew. It says Adonai Elohim, Lord God. So I'm on a motorcycle, and we're clocking about 90, 95. And we get to the place where we're going to have a couple beers. And this guy says to me, he says, what does your tattoo say? I said, which one? He said, the one on your left hand. I said, what do you think it's? He said, I have no idea. I've never seen a language like it before. I said, well, it's Hebrew, and it says Adonai Elohim, Lord God. He said, Lord God, you believe? I said, yeah. He said, Christians got tattoos? I said, sure. Why can't Christians have tattoos? Well, my mom always told me, yada, yada, yada. So we started a conversation. Long story short, I started doing a Bible study for bikers. And in the summertime, I would have a motorcycle ride-in where we did the worship service in the parking lot. But everybody who came, most of them came on motorcycles. And we'd have chairs and stuff out, and we'd have the motorcycles out. We'd have barbecue. I get the little bouncing things for the kids. And we would turn the entire parking lot into a worship service for bikers. And I would put on the side of my church, instead of putting the sermon title, it would say, Jesus rode a donkey, we ride Harleys. And I'm telling you, man, it went over crazy. Here's my point. If you're going to get to this generation, you got to be innovators, right? Nobody, I ask a preacher, well, why don't you adapt your service? Well, man, this is how we'll be doing it. I said, let me ask you a question. Are you going to go back to a rotary phone? Are you going to go back to a 1948, car? No, you have all the latest technology. So why are you not being innovative in your spirituality? The message doesn't change. It's just the delivery and the way you reach the people who, like I said, I began this conversation by saying the churches that are surviving now, they learned how to use Zoom as a platform, right? COVID forced us to be innovative in our spirituality. And so I think that we just have to be more innovative and not so stoic. And here's the other part. Stop telling these kids they're lazy because they didn't work as hard as we did. My father worked 3 jobs, right? So I could go to college. My sisters and brothers could go to college, right? I worked so my kids could go to college. My youngest niece just graduated. There are 4 of us in my family with degrees. 3 of us are doctors. Both of my sons are degreed. Both of my nieces and nephews are now degreed. That started with one person, my dad working 3 jobs to make sure I could go to school, right? But they did not have to work as hard because we ran the road. We learned, we made the connections, we did the networks. The same thing happens in the church, right? We have to be able to understand that these kids are not lazy. We just gave them more because we had more, right? And because we had more, obviously we still need to challenge them. Like I would always make my sons carry books wherever they went. We went to the basketball court, you still got to take a book because if you're sitting on the sidelines, read the book. In the car, en route to baseball practice, read the book, right? Because I wanted them to have a vocabulary where they could communicate. But just because they're doing it differently doesn't make them lazy. And I think that sometimes what happens, the older generation calls the younger kids lazy because they're not doing it the same way that we did. Well, they don't have to, because we laid the foundation so their life would be easier.
Well said. I mean, I think, if we look at, this COVID-19 pandemic seemed to have forced us to do a lot of things differently.
Yes. Yeah.
And I hope that, a lot of conversations, you hear folks talking about going back to normal, but I hope that this new normal that we going forward is a new normal based on truth, justice, liberty, man, and reconciliation.
Yeah.
Is there anything going forward that you are most optimistic about for us? In other words, I heard Angela Davis talk about it's different. She felt like this Black Lives Matter or this movement is different this time around. Is there anything this time around that gives you confidence or hope going forward?
I think there's a couple things. Academically, the ability to connect cross collegiately and cross racially. I'll tell you what I mean. So I have a friend of mine who is the director of African-American Studies at a university in Wyoming. And he's also interested in some of the things I'm doing, and I'm interested in some of the things he's doing. So we are putting together a blueprint for a platform where he and I would integrate. We're both teaching Intro to African-American Studies this semester. He has one tack, I have a different tack, and we're going to have specific times throughout the semester where both of our classes will meet at the same time. So you got students in Wyoming, students in Florida, right? Two different environments, both PWIs, but still culturally different. And these are Black and brown students and white students, but they're engaging about subject matter that wouldn't happen without Zoom, right? I got a friend over at Lincoln University, where I went to school, who also teaches African and African American studies. And what I want to do is, I want to do the exact same thing, a PWI and an HBCU talking about the same information, and then have these students integrating by way of Zoom. That is going to be off the chart. So I'm working on a blueprint. The third thing is I talked with a couple of my colleagues. I want to, because I study Middle Passage, I want to take a group of students to Africa. There's one of my colleagues, she does a Blacks in France trip every year. I want to do one in Africa. You know why? Because there are still some of us who still think that Africa is a country, right? And it's not. But I want them to really get a sense of what it would be like to be on African soil. You'd be surprised how many Black students who graduate from UF with a degree in African American Studies and never been to Africa. That's just preposterous to me, right? And so I think that getting some of these scholars the opportunity to go to the motherland and come back, to integrate cross-culturally, that we're spreading a new way of looking at Africans in history and African Americans in history. Because if you're really, and I said this earlier, if you're really going to build a relationship with someone or a group of people, you have to have some kind of historical foundation that suggests that both people are contributing equally to the process. We respect people that contribute into our lives and vice versa. When we think somebody's a freeloader, we don't have time for them. And for the most part, the way history has been written, it is as if Black people and Asians and so on have been freeloaders, when in fact, we pretty much built this country.
So I actually wanted to ask a question about your research. You talked about scuba diving and how you moved to Florida for it. Can you talk about how you got involved in like scuba diving research and what it's like in Florida compared to other places?
Yeah. So I read this book called The Guerrero, which sank off the coast of Florida, right off the Keys. And in the back of the book, they mentioned a guy by the name of Ken Stewart, who lives in Tennessee. He's a diver, a member of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. I'm also a member of NABS. And I shot him an email because I was interested in some of the research they were doing on the Guerrero. He invited me to come down to a training called Diving with a Purpose. That's a collection of Black divers who train college students and others who are interested in marine archaeology, coral restoration, and so on. And so when I started thinking about doing a dissertation, I wanted to know how many slave ships were at the bottom of the ocean. Well, out of about 35,000 voyages, there's about 5,000 ships that sank one way or another. They either sank by accident, they ran into a reef, sometimes the captain sank them. And for instance, if you bought a ship into Puerto Rico and you didn't think you would make enough money to cover the tariffs and sail and make sales on the marketable enslaved Africans, sometimes the captain would just sink the ship. It would be cheaper to sink the ship and buy a new one than to pay the tariffs. And so what can we learn from these ships underwater, right? And plus, I started diving when I was in college. I was a phys ed major, so scuba diving was one of the courses I took, and I just liked it. I like being in the water. The problem is, when you dive, one, you never dive alone. And most often when I would go, I would end up on a boat with white people. Well, you got to be able to buddy up with somebody. If you know anything about diving and something happens underwater, you got to share your mouthpiece. Well, sometimes the white folks don't want to share a mouthpiece with a Black person. So I'm ended up by myself. That's not a good idea. So, I started looking for opportunities to dive with Black people. And that's how Diving with a Purpose came into existence. So when I started looking at doing a Ph.D. at Michigan State, I wanted to figure out a way to integrate diving, underwater research with the Middle Passage. And that's kind of how I got there.
Cool. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Dr. Stevenson, middle passage, one of the things, as a matter of fact, we're going to go to the Bible. There's this story in the Bible. It's called, when the children of Israel left Egypt, right? They walked with Joseph Bones. In other words, they made sure they did not leave Joseph Bones
in Egypt. Mm-hmm.
And I draw that as an analogy to currently. You talk about diving and going back to some of these sacred sites, and there seem to be now, I don't know if I'm mistaken, now there seems to be a greater awareness or respect or value, not just only for these underwater grave sites, but African American grave sites. And we know that there's this research project going on to look into UF's connection going back. Yeah. What do you see? Do you get that sense now that from your dives and whatnot, bigger picture that there is that we are taking our ancestors with us?
Absolutely. I think that one of the important things about African religiosity is our connection to our ancestry. I don't know if you just to give an example, if you saw the movie Black Panther, when he dies, he goes to be with his father, right? In the spiritual realm, right? Because ancestry is important. And again, I think that Europeans, when they looked at African peoples, the assumption was, well, they don't dress like us. Well, shoot, it's 100 degrees in Africa. It's a lot different than when you're in England, right? So you're not supposed to dress like that, right? They don't eat the same kind of food stuff. Well, the ground is different. The culture is different. So those kind of things are, that Europeans put a prime on, they didn't, quote, see in Africa. But Africans have always been connected to the ancestry. There are some ethnic groups, when a person dies, they still may leave food in the room because they expect the ancestor to come back. So it's those kinds of things that we are becoming more aware of, because there are people who are doing research like I do and others who understand that connection to our ancestry. You've heard this before. The brothers on the corner, you got a bottle of wine, everybody put in 50 cents, and you pour out a little something for the brothers who's not with you. That's a libation. That's Africanism. That's what Africans do, right? They're pouring out something for the brothers and the sisters who aren't with us. They're acknowledging our ancestry. So we do these things, but we don't know why. Right? And what I think is happening now, because we're doing this kind of research, we are beginning to acknowledge, but also to import these ideas. Can I share my screen for a minute? All right, hold on for a
while. George may be able to.
I got it.
I got it. There we go.
I got it. Okay, so this is me. Right? You can now probably tell by my dreadlocks. But this is me working on a ship with a country. This is when I was doing my first training. The ship was called the Outline Wreck. And it's right off the coast of Florida. It's down in the Keys. And we are actually doing what they call a site mapping. We're creating a map of the site of this particular wreck. Now we're working in a debris field. A lot of these ships, when they've been underwater for 200 or 300 years, they're not intact, right? They're scattered all over the place. Like here's a part of that little round thing at the bottom there. We think is part of the cannon. Later on, you'll see me start ascending. You'll see me go right over top of the anchor. But these are students. This guy right here is a student. That's my dive buddy right there for this trip. But you'll find that we're starting to learn more about how to do this stuff so we can make those connections. Because I think it's important that when we think about African ancestry and religion, that we understand the importance of a proper burial, right? There is a significance in the way we buried our own. And you would be surprised, one, how many people jumped overboard, and drown themselves for what we call transmigration. But other than that, just the bodies that were thrown overboard. Oftentimes they would take a black man and tie him to the back of the ship and just drag him because the sharks would follow the ships to prevent insurrection. So this is the kind of stuff we learn, right, from doing this kind of research. And I think it, at least for me, it brings a sense of pride, sometimes a sense of anger, but also a reminder that I'm connected to a great people. People who came through that Middle Passage and survived, and we're still here, and now what we have to do is we have to get to a place where we're educated enough to not just be surviving, but thriving. We want to make some more inroads. We want to, my wife and I, we have a 529 for my grandson and my granddaughter. So when they go to college, they won't have to pay for it, right? Because the Bible says, a good man leaves an inheritance for his children and his children's children. Well, my dad couldn't do that. So my dad worked 3 jobs, right? So we could go to school. Now I work 2 jobs. So my sons can go to school, right? And so on and so on. So we're constantly getting better, but then we want to get to a place where we're building wealth, right? And I think that what's happening when we solidify how it's historically important we are as a people, will not be as ashamed of ourselves, because most of everything else we've been taught is that we were inferior. And so I think that we need to do this kind of research because it brings, at least for people like me, it brings a level of pride, a level of acknowledgement of those who came before me, and their tenacity. What it took to live in an environment that was designed to keep them oppressed.
Thank you.
If I might ask another question or two, I wanted to ask, what was your book on? You mentioned that you were writing a manuscript.
Yeah. Where is it? It's entitled Resistance. Where the heck is it? It's over there somewhere. It's entitled Resistance, Suicide by Drowning During the Middle Passage. And what the book looks at is how resistance took place at sea. I'm a swimmer. I have a pool here at my house. And one of the things that I am very conscious of is I could drown. I could jump into that pool, bang my head, drown. I could jump off of a ship, run out of air and drown. But what goes through the mind of a person who jumps in the water to drown deliberately? They know there are few ways of dying that are as frightful as drowning, and when I started looking at some traditional African religions like the Igbo, many of them believed if they died in the water, their spirit would go back to Africa. Again, dealing with the ancestry part, right? Going back to Black Panther, Killmonger says, I'd rather jump off of a slave ship like my ancestors and drown in the sea than be a slave, right? But what psychologically, what does a person have to do to convince themselves to drown in the water? And that's what I studied, because I wanted to know psychologically. And there were a couple of studies done, and I use them in my research, on psychology of drowning, right? And psychology of suicide. And you got to really have some big gonads, to drown yourself. Because I've been close to drowning. I was underwater on a dive one time, and I have a astigmatism in my eyes. And so sometimes 8s look like 3s, 3 look like 8s, and 6s. And numbers that have curves in them oftentimes give me difficulty without my glasses. And so I looked at my air gauge. I thought I had 800 pounds left. I only had 3. And I was about 150 yards from the exit point, underwater at 64 feet. And we're going back, and then after I looked again and I realized now I'm at 250. So I'm actually running out of air underwater, right? And I panicked. I had, but my training kicked in. I slowed my breathing down. I began a slight ascent so that I could start decompressing before I got to the surface. But shoot, man, I was scared half to death. I could have drowned underwater. And I had a buddy, I let him know. I showed him my air gauge, that. And he probably would have buddied with me if I wanted to. Matter of fact, the guy's Greek. His name is Adam. He's one of the few guys I dived with when I was in Michigan, because there were no black divers back then. Most of the guys I dove with were white guys. And by the time we got to the exit point, I'm at 100 pounds of air, man, scared half to death. So, I know what that panic is like, and I got all the equipment. I got on fins, a wetsuit, mask, a buddy. But you're in the middle of the ocean. You've been at sea for 14 days, and you jump in the ocean. What does that take? I mean, that takes tenacity. That takes a understanding of the afterlife that goes beyond anything I'm accustomed to. So that's what the book is about.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
If I might also ask, in the interview from last week, you mentioned that your mother was a part of the movement, that you met Malcolm X at a very young age.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask what it's like growing up in the movement. I also have family members who've been involved in the NAACP and other Black Power organizations. So I just wanted to hear your point of view.
Yeah. My mother, we will call her woke now today. But my mother was more involved than my dad, because my dad always worked. My dad had to work 3 jobs. My dad literally worked 3 jobs. But my mother, so let me back up. So when my mother and father were about to get married, they were getting married in a city called Chester, which is outside of Philadelphia. And in those days, my parents were married in the 50s. Black men couldn't marry white women. And my mother was very light, but she wasn't white. She just light complexion. My great-grandfather on my mother's side was a Navajo Indian. My great-grandfather on my father's side was African-American. But my grandmother had to go to court with my father and my mother to prove that she was a Black woman so that they could get married. And that always stuck with her, that there was just something wrong with 2 people being in love and not being able to marry because they were different races. So when the 60s movement started, she was all in. And primarily because it affected me academically. I was beginning to learn about race and racism. And I said, you know what? This school with this education thing is irrelevant. So I dropped out of school for a week. My mother told me, if you don't get your Black blinkety blink back in school, I'm gonna kill you my own self, right? I said, Mom, but this stuff is irrelevant. We Black people, we don't need this. She said, right, I'm gonna kill you if you don't come back to school. But my mother was very clear that community organizing was key to city transformation. So she started getting involved in community organizing. I learned asset mapping, from my mom, learning how to go through a community and looking at the assets and creating maps and stuff like that. And whenever she would, and I was the oldest, so whenever she could, she would take me to the rallies, and so Malcolm X had come to Philadelphia. He was speaking at 52nd and Market. And I'd never seen a man command a crowd like that. It was just, I was like 9 years old. And he was tall, he had this red hair, these bispectacle glasses, and just cool. He had a tie on, and you know how Malcolm talks. I mean, he was just dot, 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 dot. And I just felt that if I were ever going to be someone, I'd like to be something like that, And so when I was old enough, I think I was about 13 when I read his autobiography. And I guess he's just been, I think the thing that happened that really helped me like Malcolm more was when he came back from Mecca, though he was such a nationalist before he went, when he came back, his concept was different. He understood the importance of allyship, right? And I think that's why they killed him, because they were afraid of him when he was bringing all these Black people together. And if you understand anything about racism in America, racism is not just about oppressing Black people, it's also making sure that oppressed white people don't correlate with Black people. Right? You look at Bacon's Rebellion. Back in the 1600s, they figured that out. They didn't want those indentured servants and those Africans and Indians coming against the plantation elite. They knew it. You look at the Black Panther movement, right? The Black Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition, what were they? They were the Hispanics in Chicago, and they were the white patriots. And the white folks said, no, we can't do it. We can't do that. We can't have all these poor Blacks, poor whites, and poor Hispanics against us. So we got to make something. So understanding that racism in America is not just about oppressing Blacks, it's making sure that they don't correlate or collaborate with other oppressed peoples against the elite. That's what's happening right here now in America, right? That's why fusion politics is so important, right? You look at North Carolina, where they've got gays and Blacks and whites and Asians coming together, man, they're turning this thing upside down because they figured it out that white elite America is less concerned about Black people when they're by themselves than they are when they start collaborating cross-cultural, right? And that's one of the reasons I believe they killed Malcolm, because he was starting to build allyships that were beyond the Black community, and that was going to cause them some problems.
I see. I remember reading Malcolm X's autobiography at a young age too. It was one of my first pieces of, I guess, revolutionary literature.
Yeah,
you would call it.
Yeah. One of the reasons I never sit with my back to a door because of that book. People know me. When you go to a restaurant, they say, Rik's got to sit where he can see all the doors. And I'll walk into a restaurant, I go into a restaurant with my wife, and I'm a certified pistol instructor, so I carry all the time. But the first thing I do, once we get seated, I go to the restroom. I want to know where they are. I want to know where the exits are, because if I can't find the exits or the restroom is dirty, we leave. I got that from the book. Come back to the table, babe. There's a restroom on the northeast corner. You can probably climb out the window of the bathroom if you need to, but you gotta be safe, man. How we doing on time, man? Okay.
Yeah, we have plenty. I was curious. Any other questions by Deon, Kasamba, Omar?
We want to be respectful of Dr. Stevenson's time. I mean, he has given us an hour and a half plus 40 minutes before. So, it's been fire, man. We appreciate.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, man, it's been fire.
Awesome.
Yeah, I want to echo Deon, Dr. Stevenson, and say, thank you for your time. It has been an eye-opening experiencing listening to you over the past two sessions. We certainly appreciate you participating.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for speaking. Let me think. If I might ask one or two more. I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the environment you create in your classrooms. I recently graduated from UF, and having the experience of being a Black student at UF, the disenfranchisement and the
Sure.
lack of community, but also the way that some professors don't even try to create any. I would love to hear how you create an inclusive environment in your classrooms.
Okay, so the first thing I do is I have what they call rules of engagement. And the first day of class, every student introduces themselves. And when I'm in the class, traditionally, what I do is I make them all make these little name triangles. So by the end of the first or second week, I memorize all my students' names. So I can call my students by name. That's very personal. Then I have the rules of engagement. And the first one is there are no dumb questions, right? Because I want them to feel free to be inquisitive. Education is about inquisition. It's about learning, right? It's about asking those other questions. The second thing I do is I share with them that all of us will not learn at the same rate, but we will all learn something, right? That some people get it differently. I use a number of different modalities for teaching. I use a teaching method called critical pedagogy. And it's teaching through inquiry. I don't lecture in my classes. I provide information that we can dialogue about based on the reading and the material. So they have a reading assignment, and when they come to class, I ask them questions based on the assignment. And then, pronounce your name again. Kasamba?
Kasamba Kokai.
Okay, so I would say, Kasamba, on page 26, James Cone says so-and-so. What do you think? And then you respond. And then I'd say, okay, so what do you think, Deon? Do you think Kasamba caught exactly what the author is saying, or do you have a different observation? And then Deon responds. And then I'll say, okay, so-and-so, and then we create this space, right? And then, so Kasamba says, well, I like what he said. And I say, who said? Ask him what his name is. Deon. Oh, I like what Deon said. And so now what's happening is in the classroom, the students are seeing each other as colleagues, right? Then the other thing I do in my classroom is I allow my students to ask me questions and maybe even off book, because I want them to understand that my classes are not just about the curriculum, it's about their lives, right? And I am more concerned that they get an A in life than I am about passing my class. Because if you know anything about memorization, you can memorize enough material to pass the test, have no idea what the course was about at all, right? So that's not it. What I want them to do is learn. And learning and memorization are not synonymous. Yeah, I'm quite sure if you're taking foreign language, you study enough to pass the test, and then once that language is over, you have no idea what you're talking about, right? But I want them, to learn the material, which means it has become a part of them, right? I want my students to leave the classroom saying, man, that made so much sense. As opposed to, I have no idea what he was talking about. I'm glad the class is over. I mean, I literally have students who have said, man, I am so sorry this semester is over because it's been the best experience. I just got 3 campus diplomat awards, right? From students who were saying, this is the best class I've ever had. I'm graduating. I'm so sorry I didn't have it before. Why? Not because of the information. That's only part of it. The other part is, I improved on their understanding of their own humanity. That's when you're changing lives. When people feel that their humanity has been validated, no matter what their culture, their race, their gender, their age, when they know that you are concerned about them, that's when they dive in, and that's when they learn.
Very insightful. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That insight, we could take it across the board, not just in the classrooms, but I mean, across UF campus, we can take what you do to really see and affirm and value each person in that space, and they come out of it not only living and learning, but they come out of it better person for it. This is, if I'm hearing you correctly.
You're right. I'm gonna tell you something. I had 3 students over the past 4 semesters come out of the closet in my class. You know, I mean, come on. Do you know what comfort level that said?
That's a safe space.
Come on, man. It's a safe space.
All day.
You know, I mean, and I was so honored. And one of them, I would have never known this woman was gay, you know, and she just felt like that was the place for it. And when she was applying for a teaching position, and she was afraid that she probably wouldn't do well. And she called me, we did a Zoom, and she just sent me an email about 3 weeks ago saying she got the job and she was just so grateful for the conversation that we had afterwards. That's what teaching's about, man. You know, that's transformative, bro. All the A's in the world can't beat that.
That's a little taste of freedom right there.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so we good?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe that is all the questions we have. Yeah, we thank you very much, Dr. Stevenson, for taking the time to speak with us today and the previous session as well, and for participating. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the recorder off at this point.
Okay, so do I send my invoice to Deon or to